and I'm really excited for the next 40 minutes to speak with my counterpart, Glenn, on this topic of the board and the CEO through the lens of the chief of staff and the office of the CEO. And I thought I'd start off the conversation by, asking you, Glenn, given your, really great lengthy experience working as a management consultant, as a chief of staff today, what are some of the key elements you think about when you think of the relationship between the CEO and the board? What comes to mind?
Yeah. Obviously it's a very critical one, and there's a wide spectrum of how the CEO kind of relates to the board. Now, I think at the core of it, one is, what type of board is it? And the way I think about it, there are four types of board. There's the traditional public company board, like a Target that I presented to kind of regularly. There's a private equity board, as at Chewy, where we're a public company, but it's 70% private equity owned. There's a startup board, and then there's a nonprofit board. And I've experienced with 3 or 4 of these, and they are very diverse. Traditional public company is more about presuming all is going well with the company's performance. It's about compliance. It's about ticking the boxes and so on. It's important, but it's not typically so actively engaged in the day-to-day. Private equity board, very different. It's all about growth, performance against the financial plan, getting a high ROI exit, and they will typically roll up their sleeves and dive in more. The startup board, there are probably others who can probably speak to it better than me, because that's one of the 4 I haven't had direct experience with. But I guess similar to the PE board, it's about accelerating growth, bringing the network of the investor base, to the company to help it grow, but also looking at an exit like PE. And then finally, a nonprofit board is really about, raising money and supporting the mission. So again, I think different from the other 3. The other interesting thing about the nonprofit board, I think, is that the bar on talent is different, and as a board member, in my case, you have to accept that and just understand that nonprofit organization employees, they're motivated by the mission, not wealth creation. And that makes for a different dynamic, and you have to kind of work with them differently. So just in some, 4 different types of boards, and, how the CEO interacts with them, I think depends highly on, is it a public company board? Is it a PE or startup board, or is it a nonprofit?
These are great distinctions, Glenn. And, absolutely the entity type really determines not only the board makeup, but also the talking points, or, what the board cares about, right? Like you said, whether you're trying to head towards an exit or do a value creation plan in the PE case, or on the corporate side, obviously much more senior matters. It depends on the tenor of the conversation, and then also the makeup of the board itself.
Consulting as it relates to impact.
Fabrice, I don't know if you can help that. Thank you. Absolutely. And I was going to ask you as well, based on your experience with maybe 3 out of the 4 boards, have you seen different board makeup in terms of the types of personas that, join the board? Can you speak to the type of titles or the type of backgrounds these board members might have?
Yeah, well, on a private equity board, it's typically just kind of partners from the private equity firm. If there are multiple firms, there'll be multiple folks, but they'll typically be partners. Like I say, kind of deeply engaged, kind of rolling up their sleeves. On a public company board, the design there is to be kind of more representative of the community kind of at large. So I think there's more of an emphasis on diversity for public company boards. There are plenty of public companies which insist that a board member be a current or prior CEO themselves, or at least a C-suite member. So that's another difference.
Oh, and I think maybe Glenn got muted there.
Okay. Sorry about that. I was going to say on the nonprofit board, there's the board members typically will be, supporters of the mission of the organization, but I think importantly kind of give money. It's the one type of board membership where like you pay to serve, as opposed to you get some kind of remuneration for being part of it. But it's very rewarding in many ways that I can talk about later. So I think those are the different profiles. I would say the one common thread across these different boards is that, the leader needs to build trust, with the board members. And they do that through, I would kind of look at the, Charles Green's classic trust equation, which is it's based on credibility, reliability, and intimacy, and which is undermined by self-orientation. So, the ability to consistently deliver results, gives you the kind of the reliability. You say you're going to do something, you're going to make some sort of expansion or pursue some sort of strategy. The reliability of that and the credibility of what you bring to the table are important. I'd say the intimacy is getting to know the board. So another common thread, I think, is the importance of the leader, the CEO in this case, or the director of the museum or the nonprofit, is getting to know the board members personally, and building those relationships.
Well, I think this is a nice segue to think about what's the role of the chief of staff in the office of the CEO to promote those three things that you just mentioned, right? How can credibility, reliability, and intimacy be amplified by the office of the CEO and the chief of staff? So I guess my next question to you is, what kind of responsibilities or intersections does the chief of staff and the office of the CEO have to the board? And then the follow-up question is, how does credibility, reliability, and intimacy grow from this support team around the CEO?
Yeah, it's a good question. I was thinking about this session over the past couple of days, and does the chief of staff have a relationship with a board? I mean, the CEO certainly does, and it's just one of the most important kind of set of stakeholders in the CEO's kind of network. I would say the chief of staff does not have a relationship with a board per se. And what do I mean by that? I think other aspects of what the chief of staff does, our role is to support the CEO in kind of building their relationship, with the board, making sure they're prepared. I was recently called in to help get together some folks for, to prepare for a special session on a topic that the board was interested in. I not just pulled together the document, but brought the thinking together, kind of rallied the troops, prepared them, said, here are the difficult questions that will come up. And this is all in support of a successful kind of subcommittee meeting with the board. But I would say that, my role is I want to make this easy as possible for the CEO. And by that, I mean, he doesn't have to worry about pulling together kind of the thought piece. He doesn't have to worry about preparing his team for this. How would you respond to this question? How would you respond to that question? He can, in my case, he can just show up, right, and be part of the discussion. And I've relieved him of that burden of all the preparation that would have gone into that. I think that's an example of, the chief of staff role is critical in helping further that relationship with the board. I'm in the room, I know board members, I say hello, kind of we chit chat, that's fine, but it's in support of the goal of making this a successful interaction and to make it reflect well on the principal, the CEO in this case.
Yeah, absolutely, Glenn. And that's consistent with what I found in some of the research that we've done at Cedar on the office of the CEO and the role of the chief of staff. And I think a lot more, in the wings, preparation of materials or anticipating objections, like you mentioned, preparing the CEO to step out on stage, so to speak, and to have that really great performance. I'm curious too, what kind of maybe follow-up discussions you might have with the CEO after, saying, hey, there's maybe things that we noticed or stakeholder relationships that we want to prepare or either increase. What kind of follow-up sessions or activities happen after that board meeting?
Yes, super important. I mean, typically what I do is help, facilitate a debrief kind of with the team, right? How did this go? Kind of what stood out to you? Kind of what are the follow-up actions, that we need to take? What sort of further communication do we need to have with the board? So, the board meets quarterly, but it's not kind of one and done per quarter. There are discussions that go on in the interim. So to help prepare some follow-up, I guess in the example that I just gave, the follow-up, there are certain things that we said we would do to kind of make sure, as chief of staff that, hey, here are the three takeaways that we need to follow up with in actions and what form and who we're going to present it to and so on and so forth. So again, I don't want the CEO kind of worrying about has this been prepared? Has that analysis been prepared? Like, I want to be the one to help kind of work with the team and get that ready, get a draft in front of him, and then figure out how best to share that with the board. So yeah, I think the debrief and the acknowledgement and the recognition that, the board is just not a quarterly thing. It's an ongoing event and set of relationships. And this is, I would say, a common thread between, private, for-profit and nonprofit boards as well. I think the best conversations and the best way I've been able to add value as a member of a nonprofit board is, if I hear something is going on, with a museum, with a staff member, with recruitment, we're building a new $75 million museum. If we're hitting any snags, I got to pick up the phone and call a board member or talk to the director. You just have to have this kind of regular, engagement with the board in between the meetings.
That's so important, Glenn. The board meeting isn't just like this one and done point in time milestone and then everything goes silent. Or maybe it does happen for some companies, but they're not actually leveraging the board in the right way and actually destroys the relationship. So thinking about these one-to-one board member relationships in between the board meetings is helpful. And of course, you can seek out advice based on their domain expertise, right? If a certain board member has experience in fundraising or go to market, you can seek that out. I have a question from the chat, and maybe we go back to the beginning part of the board process. Can you speak about the hours and the work that you do as a chief of staff and the rest of the office of the CEO team does in order to make sure that the content that's put together for the board packet is, like you said, reliable, so it can add to your credibility. And then also it tells the narrative and the arc that you want to, deliver in that board meeting itself. So maybe more about the process, the sausage making.
That's a really great question too, because I think it's really essential to have a narrative that you bring to the board, because yes, there are ongoing discussions, but it's also an opportunity to every quarter step back and reflect on like where the company's performance is. Are the investments paying off? What are you hearing from customers? Like, and that does change over time. Who does this in the role of chief of staff varies considerably. In the case of my present role, the office of the chief counsel and finance work together and construct it. My role, and I would be an advocate for this, and because there is a lot of heavy lifting that goes into preparing that document. A lot of it is finance based, so thus the finance team is involved. Where I add value is being part of the review process along with the CEO as that narrative starts to come together, and asking questions about, hey, we've been talking offline about market share and some of the gains and something we feel good about that. That's not reflected in the doc. Like, how about we put that in there? So I think asking questions, staying close to the CEO and company performance, and making sure that as chief of staff, you're taking the opportunity to step back and synthesize kind of what's going on and make sure that makes its way into the narrative that's shared with the board.
Absolutely. I think there's oftentimes too much presentation of numbers without the overarching headline or narrative that, again, destroys maybe the intimacy aspect of what you just mentioned. You get very intimate by telling a story, you create relationships, and you're able to tell a much more compelling perspective, right, with that narrative arc. And oftentimes, and I've done this myself, you'll go through multiple revisions, right? It's not just a one and done. There's a dress rehearsal. So it's really important that you set yourself up for the chiefs of staff on this call. Set yourself up for success by having multiple review sessions in advance of that board meeting. So make sure that you prepare early. Lisa and Andy have a question, which I think would be interesting for you, Glenn. It's really around what happens in a crisis communication or a crisis for the CEO and the board. How does the chief of staff maybe act as a support or enablement function when a crisis comes up, so that they are able to take what the CEO wants to communicate to the board and make sure that it's handled appropriately? Do you have a view on this?
Yeah, I think Certainly, it wouldn't be a surprise to the chief of staff and the CEO. I think for me, it's, how best to, position that message and kind of talk about the company's response to it. The way I like to think about this is, a CEO needs to have like a trusted relationship with the board, needs to be transparent, but it's not a confession, right? It's an obligation. It's an obligation if you're facing some sort of crisis. I'll give a quick example would be, with security, of the tech platform and customer information and so on, that qualifies as, a crisis to be managed. Unfortunately, it's an all too common one, these days, just kind of given
Right.
what we're at. So I think, being very clear, this can't be withheld from the board. It needs to be shared with the board. And then, you need to be, ready to talk to, kind of what the response has been and how to prevent it from recurring. So I think just kind of keeping ahead of it, being frank, doing it at the appropriate kind of level of detail. And I think, for back to the trust equation, model is, being credible in terms of like, here's a solution for it, and kind of laying out the plan so that it doesn't recur.
Absolutely. They say never let a crisis go to waste. What's the opportunity for the CEO to, really step up, be credible on saying here's a solution, and then have the board track the actions so that its reliability increases, right? You say what you're going to do, you actually do it. Not only is it good for the board, it's also obviously good for the public and your shareholders and customers as well. So hopefully, these crises don't come up that often, but when they do, again, for the chiefs of staff and executive assistants on the call, really think about how you can help manage that comms component, and then work with your CEO to deliver that message back to the board.
And I've seen CEOs underestimate, the importance of speaking to it directly and promptly with the board, including calling the board into a special meeting when something like a security breach happens. And in one example, a CEO did not directly and quickly enough inform the board, and ultimately that CEO left office. And I think the big contributor was facing a crisis and not moving quickly enough and openly enough about what the problem was, compounded by the fact that I think, frankly, in this case, they didn't know exactly what to do about it and couldn't come up with a credible plan to prevent it from happening again.
Absolutely. And I'm just reminded by a recent issue in a corporate board magazine around the top, 5-10 issues facing corporate boards, particularly the rise of AI and ML and data handling and security is one of the top, items on this list. We don't have good maybe guardrails or understanding and grasp around this technology, and then also the downstream security and data risk. So I'm sure this is a topic that's coming up a lot around security. Eric has a
Yeah, I was going to say, no, good point there on AI. And I think that's an example of where, a great chief of staff is looking around corners and saying to the CEO, like, hey, of course, we all know about AI. We all read about it. We all use it. Hasn't really affected day-to-day operations, but there are some ways in which it could. Shouldn't we kind of get together, the C-suite or kind of some subset of folks and talk about what it could be, and have kind of one of our leading technologists kind of speak to that. So I think, again, it's a kind of obligation, I think, of the chief of staff is to think around that corner and put these issues in front of the CEO. And it's okay as a chief, you don't have to have the answer, but like, I think at least you need to highlight, hey, this topic, whether it be kind of security breaches, AI, kind of, the diversification of the supply chain, like these issues are very real, and let's get ahead of it.
Absolutely. I think, an apt description of a chief of staff is another set of hands, or the quote unquote right hand of the CEO. But the other way of thinking about it is this chief of staff is another set of eyes and ears for the CEO to look around corners or to anticipate roadblocks, any sort of risk items that might drag the company down. It's a really valuable skill for the chief of staff to raise these issues in advance of them actually happening, right? So that you're prepared for some of these major risks. I'm going to move on to maybe one more question from the chat and then back to some of our talking points. Eric Hartline has a question around what's the interplay between the corporate secretary and the chief of staff?
Well, I think this, in my case, it's been largely around the board meetings and kind of preparation for them, as well as board committee meetings. And just making sure like all of the materials are put together, the right people are in the meetings. It sounds trivial, but it's not, because part of having credibility as a chief of staff and a CEO is that these meetings happen on time. The materials are there. The right people are in the room together. I'll just give you a quick example. I just had a board meeting last week, and there was weather in the Northeast for folks who were there. I guess there was like an April snowstorm, and 4 of our board members were stuck at LaGuardia for, waiting on 8 hours, and we're trying to juggle committee meetings. And, as a chief of staff, like, you have to roll up your sleeves. And I was on the phone trying to figure out how do we move these meetings and make sure everybody is there, and tell the board chair, like, you've been at LaGuardia for 12 hours. It's time to go home. It's okay to dial in tomorrow, even though that's not your preference. So it's kind of the theme of like, nothing is beneath you as a chief of staff. And I wouldn't say that was fun, but in a way, just like to be able to like engage and make sure everything goes smoothly. I find that actually a very fulfilling part of the role. And that's what I had to do. The corporate secretary wasn't involved in that particular situation, but certainly in terms of like preparation for the board meetings, a very central role.
Yes, I'm smiling because I'm reminded of an iconic scene in the movie The Devil Wears Prada, where they're trying to get Miranda Priestley's character back to, I think, New York to see the piano recital of her twins. And so Andy, her assistant, is really trying to find any jet that can fly out in a thunderstorm from Miami back to New York to make this happen. And she ultimately, I think, doesn't succeed, but she tries her darndest, right? And that's exactly the type of ethos and, get it done type of attitude that the chief of staff will bring to bear in some of these special situations.
Good reference, Mackenzie. Great reference.
Well, great. I think we've talked maybe more about the sausage making, the interplay of the chief of staff to the CEO pre, during, and post the board. We kind of talked about this on the onset, where you described the 4 different types of entities and the boards that they represent, versus, nonprofit versus corporate. But are there any other differences that you would maybe synthesize or bring to the conversation now? Folks that maybe are aspiring to public obviously have different roles as a board member than a private board member, right? So any differences that you would underline?
I think, part of it is just kind of paving the way. So if you kind of aspire to be a board member, starting with a nonprofit board membership, it's easier to get on that board. I think the challenge of the nonprofit board is like, are you ready to devote the time to be really engaged? I think like traditional public company boards, that's one of the similarities between them and nonprofits. There are folks who kind of just show up for meetings. There are nonprofit board members who write a check and you never hear from them. And like, that's fine. Like if that's how they want to engage. There are others, and I put myself in this category, who I want to be involved. I want to roll up my sleeve. I want to help kind of raise the bar on like talent, talk about org, talk about strategy. In the case of building this new museum, I want to see the plans. I want to meet the architect. Your results may vary depending on what you want out of it. I would say nonprofit boards need both. They need people to write checks, and they need people to be engaged in it. So it is a nice way to learn how boards work, because I think there is a ton of similarity between nonprofit boards and for-profit boards. I think the big one is the one I touched on earlier, which is, a lot of the activity and kind of the real kind of progress and insights happen by picking up the phone and talking to somebody, by going to the committee meeting. By the time we get to the quarterly board meeting, it's more of just a presentation, and it's a more kind of passive setting. Whereas obviously the one-on-one calls are not, the kind of special committee or kind of subcommittee meetings are not. That's where a lot of the action happens. So if you want to learn how a board works, I think getting involved in a nonprofit board and being an active member is a great on-ramp. The other thing in parallel is being a chief of staff, because if you're a chief of staff, you're going to be involved with the board, and if you're not, you should talk to your principal and figure out like how do you get connected and kind of plugged into what's happening in the board, because it is such an important constituency.
Absolutely. And I think it's a segue into another talking point around what's the pathway of the chief of staff to the corporate board, or any board really. We were having a pre-meeting call around the opportunity that it presents the chief of staff role to get exposure in a much less risk situation, right? To understand the process in which you prepare for the board, you run the board meeting, and then the follow-up. You're actually able to be sometimes in the room, right, as well. So my question to you, Glenn, which is a follow-on, is what's that pathway from chief of staff to board? And you already are obviously on a board today, but based on what you've seen talking to other chiefs of staff or folks in the office of the CEO, what's that journey, so to speak?
I think it's a great pathway. I think it's actually probably one of the best out there, because, as chief of staff, you're seeing the whole breadth of the company. Kind of, you're working with a CEO, but of course you're working with a C-suite. So you're seeing operations, you're seeing finance, you're seeing HR. So you get like the whole holistic view of a company. You get some of this as a consultant, but I think it's different being chief of staff, because consultants are usually more focused on one topic area, or the next. So I think it's great. It's great to kind of get that view. Like you were saying, Mackenzie, like you're interacting with the board, you're seeing them in motion. And I think if you're an observant person, like most of us are as chief of staff, you're observing the interaction with the CEO and different board members, and what is said and what's not, how the board members are different, what their personalities are like. And to me, one of the big success factors, if, as you're preparing for the board meeting, you say like, I bet so-and-so is going to say this. I bet so-and-so won't say anything, but will ask one question, but it'll be a good question. So it's a kind of like, kind of rate yourself on how well you know the board. And again, I think understanding like, the board is not a monolithic thing. It's made of different people with different personalities, kind of different agendas and different ways of like interacting. So observing that and appreciating that is super important. And it's a great perspective you get as chief of staff.
What a wealth of perspective and nuance there, texture, I would say, Glenn. Absolutely, I picked up on your point, really around the diversity of personalities or backgrounds that board members may have. It really obviously affects the dynamic and the types of questions. And some things I've seen, successful chiefs of staff do is really create this, kind of stakeholder map around the board, really thinking about the background, the motivation, the types of questions that are being raised by each board member, and the health of the relationship, of course, between the CEO and that board member. But it's really around the people that you get around the table, right? It's like you hold a party, right, at your house. You hold a dinner party. You kind of think about, who do I want to invite to this dinner party? What kind of backgrounds they have? What kind of conversations, might transpire at this dinner party? How do you seat maybe one person next to another person to create that dynamic? And so I go back to that dinner party analogy, maybe because I just love hosting dinner parties, but really thinking about the people around the table, how the interaction might flow. And then, like you said, assessing any sort of objections or questions that you might be uncomfortable that you can, handle in a certain way should they arise. But the people, again, I think really make up that board. And the more reps you get as a chief of staff and exposure to these personality types, the more pattern recognition you can bring with your, with yourself to that next board that you are a part of.
Yeah, good point, by the way, on like who sits where. Like you'd think like, oh, it's kind of actually it's not. There's a kind of naturally like the folks who are going to engage the most will like kind of gravitate towards the center, but normally like the non-board members, the company employees, like we're there early because we want to make sure everything's set up right and so on. But like there's this bit of a dance around the table. Okay, who's going to sit where? Do we want to, where's the CEO? Where does this board member? Where does that board member? Oh, there's a new board member. Maybe they don't need to be at the center. So even those little things like do matter, and it affects the dynamics of the meeting.
Yes. And I know it's a dramatization, so they maybe get 40% of the details right, but I'm reminded of the Succession show on HBO, right? Where, they're in the boardroom and Logan's on the call, on, voice call, by the way, which is obviously a different dynamic than actually being physically present in the board meeting itself, versus some of his children who are attempting to be his successor in the meeting itself, trying to influence a board member who's also in the meeting physically by giving them an eye when it comes to voting on a very important topic, which is, do we throw Logan out, right? So I'm just reminded again of the scene where the dynamics of on the phone versus in person, and then the seating arrangement really affects the dynamic of the board. And you really don't get access to understanding that until you've had reps, right? It's very hard to like pick up a document that says, here's how a board meeting runs, right? And then really feel that dynamic or relationship dynamic in the room.
Yeah, it's a good point. The other part that they mentioned succession, which they ended too soon. Such a good show. The importance of like the group dynamics in the room and like what role can the chief of staff play. For example, it's not unusual, and this is the case with like any group meeting where one or a couple people dominate it, because they're going to speak up, they're going to ask the tough questions, they're going to persist, which is fine. Like they're the board, that's their obligation, and like good for you if you've got a board that is so engaged. On the other hand, there are folks who have something to contribute who aren't going to speak up. So as chief of staff, what can you do to introduce them in the conversation, or kind of slack the CEO and say like, hey, why don't you ask Michael like what he thinks? We haven't heard from him. I think just as you're observing, like making sure you're getting the right participation from the right people, and it's broad and even. And sometimes, I'll be honest, like sometimes you need a relief valve, so you need someone else to weigh in, because somebody's not going to let go. Somebody's not going to let go of this one topic, and like you got to move on. So it can be very helpful to bring other people in the conversation.
Absolutely. And this is very similar to one of the main responsibilities of the chief of staff, which is making the C-suite team function well together. So, it's really borrowing from this leadership dynamic, leadership coaching role that the chief of staff has to make sure that all C-suite players are playing nicely together in the ELT meeting, and bringing that to the board meeting itself, really thinking about the dynamics, promoting voices that are maybe a little bit quieter to rise to the front, and then also helping de-escalate or not amplify some of the loudest folks in the room, that all perspectives are shared. So we're reaching almost the end of our chat here. There's one last question which I want to open or pose to you, Glenn. Really, it's around LGBTQ board representation, and it's maybe a more expansive role. Maybe we can talk about LGBTQ chiefs and also LGBTQ board members and boards themselves. But that, I just want to maybe have an open dialogue on, maybe what you're seeing in terms of representation there. And after you respond, of course, I'll add my perspective on what I see within my own, work with chiefs of staff, offices of the CEO and CEOs themselves.
Yeah, no, it's a great idea. This is something I did want to talk about, because I do think, and Fabrice, keep me honest on the stats here, but like we're woefully, as LGBTQ professionals, we're woefully underrepresented on boards. And in discussions I've had with different companies about joining their boards, and with people connected with them, they've told me, in some cases, they said kind of flat out, we need diversity. Glenn, you're not diversity. And I'm like, how can that be? Because we come from a diverse background and have faced kind of unique challenges in this world. That really shocked me, but maybe it shouldn't have, because I think the definition of what equates to diversity is narrow. It's appropriate because the conversation never used to happen like at all. It was a bunch of kind of straight white guys in the same network who went to the same clubs and knew each other. It's broadened since then, but I don't think it's broad enough. And I don't think it's really focused on, being kind of fully representative out there. But Fabrice, I know you have some perspectives on this, and you've done some research on it, and I was shocked at this number. I don't want to.
Yeah, no, we have 0.8% of board seats on Fortune 500, and that's a pretty strong number. And then we have 1.2% of board seats on NASDAQ, which, because board member had the opportunity to disclose, we know that it's a pretty serious number, meaning 5% did not disclose their sexual orientation and gender identity, even if you assume that a percentage of those people were LGBTQ plus people, it's still incredibly small in the end. So we are very underrepresented, and we actually published a report last year which explained that there were structural aspects, and actually in a way that also interests me for the part of the conversation where you talk about what is the pathway from being chief of staff to the boardroom, because sometimes those pathways are important to improve representation.
And
absolutely. And
go
sorry,
ahead.
Ben.
No, go ahead, please.
I was going to say, the chief of staff position, I think, is really fantastic at introducing, middle career talent that are high performers from diverse backgrounds. You can identify folks that are women or POC, LGBTQ, et cetera, and place them in very strong positions of power as the chief of staff in the office of the CEO. You're able to receive the mentoring and the exposure to the CEO position, and then you're exited into a director or even VP level position, which then obviously gives you the pathway to CEO or board, right? So I really see the chief of staff position, obviously there's huge tailwinds around this, by the way, which is great, to really address with hard numbers representation and have that happen at the C-suite or around the C-suite level.
Mackenzie, do you have any observations around the, for chief of staff that you have, interacted with, how is LGBTQ representation in this role?
It's only anecdotal, and maybe I need to do some more research on this very topic. I mean, obviously it's very near and dear to my heart here on this topic. But I think part of it also is educating CEOs and founders who take on the chief of staff themselves, the power of having a diverse pool of candidates as they can consider taking on the right hand, right? So it's really opening the conversation, looking, wait, what does your C-suite, leadership team look like right now? Does it all look the same, or does it look different, right? And how can you introduce this chief of staff position with a diverse candidate?
And look, we've come a long way. I think at the beginning of my career, when I was at McKinsey, and we're talking about forming an interest group of gays and lesbians at McKinsey, I think our first question was like, first of all, are we gonna get fired, or will we ever get promoted? Will we ever make partner? If we come out, our first meeting was in the basement of a brownstone somewhere in Gramercy Park, and it was almost like we had to have a secret handshake to get in. If I think about that compared to like my, most recent role, I was totally out during the interview. It's such a non-issue, which is great. So we have come a long way. I think where we are lacking like the same sort of tailwind is in board representation. And I think as a community, are making the argument that, we are a diverse part of the population, and we're just woefully underrepresented on corporate boards. And we have something unique to bring to the table. So this is why I'm so excited about participating, in this event and kind of furthering the cause here. Like, I think there's real work to be done, especially when it's still out there that like, you all are not diverse, and we know that's not the case. And, we don't want to be a token of diversity. I think we have something genuinely different perspectives and life experiences that we can bring to the table. And, I think that's unique, and it's just not recognized yet.
Absolutely. And it's segueing into the question that Lisa and Andy put into the chat, which is, hey, why take on an LGBTQ board member? Like, what's, the unique perspective, or what do you add? And I'd build on what you just mentioned, Glenn, to say that if you look at Gen Z, they are the most LGBTQ, I think, self-representing and identified workforce, obviously, population, but then obviously workforce. I think in order to, attract, retain talent, to speak to customers, to partners, to anyone in the world, that type of narrative and sensitivity to some of these issues, you're not going to get if you're obviously a straight white male and at the top. So having that board representation to speak to a real growing population, is really valuable. That would be my kind of argument to increasing that diversity at the board level.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I think we have different life experiences, we have unique perspectives, like, on the world. But at the same time, yeah, like the new generation, like fully expects this. And there is a generational shift happening. I remember once I was in the board of the Asian Art Museum in San Francisco, and I was presenting some audience research and segmentation and who's coming to the museum and who's not and kind of why. And one of the segments that we identified was LGBTQ, and the board chair at that time, who was 92 years old, very sweet lady, kind of raised her hand and said, "Excuse me, Glenn, what is LGBTQ? What does that stand for?" And I thought that was like very sweet, because like she didn't know, but like our presumption is like everybody knows, and they don't, right? But there's a generational shift underway where there's a very clear expectation. And I think that extends to, all other aspects of diversity. It's not to say that's not important. It still is, but I think we need to be more expansive. And as a community, we need to figure out how do we pave the way for each other, right? How do we network with each other? How do we become, advocates for representation, of our community on boards?
Absolutely. The intersectionality point is so real, right? I have two intersections for myself as an Asian American and LGBTQ, but obviously there's many more, right? So it's how do we uplift and elevate these intersectionality discussions? And then, like you said, there's definitely great opportunity to say, hey, well, we're thinking about one aspect of diversity. How do we think about many others, right? How do we incorporate that into the conversation? And of course, I want to celebrate. Of course, this great work is coming from you yourself. You were the pioneer of the, gays and lesbians at Mackenzie, and you have paved the way, for a lot of the work today. So thank you for that. I'm looking at the time too. Maybe we have an opportunity to open the floor to questions from the group, and I know that obviously some have been coming in through the chat, but maybe we let some folks put some questions in the chat for Glenn and maybe myself and Fabrice.
I think there's one from Noah. I don't know if we touched on this one. As the chief of staff, manage challenges with an over-involved board and nonprofit org, and what strategies can it? That's a really good one, because a nonprofit that's a great question. No, a nonprofit is not a for-profit board, and I think the temptation, look, I'm guilty of this. In earlier on in my nonprofit board service, is just to weigh in and like, we should be running this, with the same sort of high standards for for talent, for efficiency, everything that kind of drives a for-profit organization. And of course, that was not the case. I think certainly bringing some of that is important. I think the big thing for me is, is being aware that like the pace of change is going to be different, and the hire and fire kind of dynamics that one sees at for-profit companies is different. And you just have to accept that. And like, how fast can you move, and what ways can you help, the organization move forward? So I think there's definitely temptation for people to join a nonprofit board and try to push too fast and get too involved. In those cases, what I've seen is that the CEO kind of will push back. We'll have that conversation and say, we appreciate your being on the board. We certainly appreciate your writing checks. Like, that's great. You bring something special, but like, this is a different world, and let me share that with you. And as a board member, it's actually better to get ahead of that and have the discussion with the other board members and the CEO about expectations and, how much can you push, and what's the right role.
Thanks for that answer, Glenn. And folks on the call, feel free to add any questions for myself or Glenn or Fabrice.
I see Ali Mackenzie has a question. Go ahead, Ali.
Actually, it was less of a question, but more just adding to what Glenn said. I love hearing this, by the way. It's so helpful sometimes because we're on an island, and so it's nice to come out and see other chiefs and hear what they're doing. And sometimes it's like, oh, here's a good idea, or oh, it confirms or denies what I was doing before. But in tying in what you said earlier, Glenn, about how the nonprofit boards are usually have a different level of talent, a lot of times what I've found in the nonprofit sector as a board member for the board is that because you have a different level of talent, maybe they are not always putting together the board packets as quickly or as tightly or as cleanly. And so as a chief of staff on the nonprofit boards, the way that I found that I can really help out the executive director or the CEO better is to make sure that that's happening. And one of the symptoms of it, of the bad outcomes, is that I've seen a nonprofit board reach into management more often, and it's usually a symptom of them not getting what they need from the CEO. And sometimes it's not always the CEO that's not doing it, but it's that they're not getting all that prep and material ahead of time. So tying back into what you said earlier, Glenn, I think it's really important, especially for the nonprofit ones I've had experience in, is that you are doing that air traffic control and orchestrating and getting everything ready, like you said, with the CEO. And in those instances, when there's a lot more prep ahead of time, then I've seen less of the reaching down of the board into the management because they're getting what they need.
Yeah, that's a great point. Ali, what's your experience too with, in the board meeting itself, kind of a one-way report out versus like a kind of a real dialogue and in an open environment where people can ask questions? What have you seen in that spectrum, and what role have you played?
Sure. It depends. I've got experience in public and startup and nonprofit boards. So it was really interesting to listen to what you were saying here. And I was like, ooh, that's a good idea, or this ties together. And the answer is it depends. It depends on what type of a board it is. Because if you have, usually in my experience, I've seen if you have a board that is not getting what they need and the way that they need it, or sometimes it's in the time that they need it. Some people are really sticklers about the time, then they will reach down into management. And I've seen them go over a CEO or go over. And this is where, to Glenn's point, as a chief of staff, if you've got a really great rapport with the other board members in a place where you can pick up the phone or call them or say something, we as chiefs of staff can kind of see kind of the handwriting on the wall or the train wreck that's about to happen, if you will, because we're from the balcony looking on the dance floor to see all of the different things that are happening. So even if our CEO is out of town or busy, if we can pick up the phone and make a phone call and let them know, hey, this is happening, or hey, it's going to be a day later, or just the communication, just the transparency of what's happening, I've seen oftentimes divert the bad outcome of a board reaching down in and wanting to, before you know it, a board member is having a conversation with the CFO or with someone else, and the CEO is like, what happened? How did that go wrong? And so as a chief of staff, if we can play that chief gap filler, sometimes it's a chief counselor because somebody needs to talk through something and they don't know how to present it to the board. There's all different things that can come up. And so depending on what type of a board and the players in the room, like you said, to really understand who they are, why they're there, do they have power? Do they have influence? All those things come into play. So thank you so much for the session. I really appreciate it.
No, thanks for such good questions and insights. One of the things I was thinking about is when a board member is reaching down to the org, I think one of the questions for oneself as chief of staff and for the CEO is like, well, why is this happening? And I think you did touch on that, but like, well, that's interesting. Like, why do they feel the need to do that? You don't want to cut them off from it, but on the other hand, like, they're looking for something they're not getting from us, right? As office of the CEO, and what do we do about that?
Yeah, that root cause analysis, did we not cover it in the board deck, or was it not communicated effectively? Was it not part of the narrative? Were we not anticipating this objection? Those are some of the questions that you can ask, in a CEO chief of staff session so that you prepare for the next board meeting. And like you said, Glenn, you want to obviously not cut them off. You want to handle that inquiry, right? But you also want to prepare for the next touch points so that you reduce that downward motion if it's not appropriate.
There's another question which is great in the chat about how do you deal, and have you had that experience of dealing with a dysfunctional board? And that person mentioned the mushroom board, a board that is kept in the dark and fed manure. Any ideas on how a board member can navigate that? So basically talking about a board that is not getting the full picture, that is kind of kept away from issues, that is not involved in decision making. So that might not be the best question for the chief of staff, but from the point of view of a board member, Glenn, how would you navigate that if you feel that you're not given the information and the room to help guide the CEO?
Yeah, no, it's a really good one, and I'm not going to name names, but yeah, they're out there. Dysfunctional boards are out there, and I think as a CEO, if you have a mushroom board, I haven't heard that one. That's a really good analogy. You're missing out on something. The board is a resource. In other board interactions I've had where you have very active members asking very good questions, like that's a gift, right? And if you have a board which is too passive, which is just kind of checking the boxes and not asking those tough questions, like I think it's a weakness of the CEO. And as a chief of staff, I think you need to talk about that. You need to have the discussion around like, hey, we present to the board, they all fly in, we have the dinner, like that's nice. We just present, it's very one way, there are no questions. That's a problem to me. I've been in boards where the preparation gets down a level like you're reading from a teleprompter, and versus ones where you just kind of show up. I don't like either extreme very much, actually, but particularly for the teleprompter one, you got to be asking yourself, like, why are you reading from a teleprompter, and what does that convey to the board in terms of your openness to, kind of their asking questions and so on. So I think it's a red flag for me if it's a mushroom board, and as a good chief of staff, like sometimes you have to have the tough discussions. That's one I definitely have with the principal you support.
Coincidence of the calendar of the association is having its board meeting next week. So now I know that I'm going to have to try as awake as possible and prepared. I also love the question of Lisa Padilla. I'm very interested in that question, Glenn. Do you, as a professional that has succeeded in business, do you feel that being gay is kind of explain part of who you are in business? And do you, and by expansion, do you think that LGBTQ plus people bring a specific lens to decision making? Because as you know, sometimes there's a good understanding that women have a different outlook on life, have a different outlook on business, and that therefore there is benefit to that diversity in the boardroom. That can be understood sometimes on race, but when it comes to LGBT people are like, well, why would your sexual orientation and gender identity be relevant to the diversity of thought that we're thinking? So I would love to get your point of view on that.
Yeah, and this is a tricky one because look, even as an LGBTQ plus community, we are diverse. I would say, but one thing that we have in common is, our life experience kind of growing up, coming to terms with being gay, being an invisible minority is unique. And I think when you have a different lived experience, you look at the world in a different way. Like maybe I can speak in my own case, like I'm just much more observant of people and relationships and so on, because, I'm always kind of looking at this straight world from the outside in. So I think just that lived experience that we have is different. Another thing that can be different is, as both a consultant and now as a chief of staff, I'm very happy kind of supporting others in being successful. How much of that comes from being gay and not feeling like I'm the one out in front of everything like that? I think that's a very personal thing, but I think it's relevant. And again, it comes down to lived experience of being like an invisible minority and trying to navigate this world that we don't quite fit in. But all of us on this call, like we've found our success, in this world, and we've done that through overcoming challenges. And I think that's a very unique experience that, that we can bring to the board.
And I'll add something that I think sometimes we also have an understanding of what that segment of consumers is waiting to see, right? If you're Chewy, maybe, there is a message to the LGBT population that you can help, not always, but sometimes that we can help craft because we have a better understanding of that segment of consumers. And, I live in New York. I can tell you that most gay people have one or two dogs, So
our proxy children.
So, maybe sometimes we help guide that. Well, look, we are at time, so I'm incredibly grateful for both of you taking the time. I have to say that, Mackenzie, you're saving me because I love those webinars. We did a lot last year, and then since the beginning of the year, we've been terrible at it. So it's great to have the opportunity to be together and discuss these topics. It's also great to get to discover Glenn, and what he's doing. So on that note, thank you both. I wish you a good weekend. I think, you know, we will definitely have more opportunities to also share the work that Cedar is doing, and maybe, you know, create a network of chief of staff that are interested at some point in having a board career, right? And build those pathways. So I'm very grateful to both of you. I know that we didn't put any link to get in touch with you, Mackenzie. So, you know, I think I have it here. You know, the website of Cedar, first of all, if I find it. And then beside that, you know, we have a newsletter. And so I'll probably put a link if you know, I'll ask your authorization, but if you don't mind, I'll put a link to the recording. And I think he has your LinkedIn too.
Yeah, please add me to LinkedIn. Make that offer. I think as a community, like, we need to be better networked as we think about kind of board membership and supporting each other. So I welcome that. This is a great group. Super impressed by your backgrounds and really good questions. But there is power in this community. So let's get connected here.
Well, thank you so much, Glenn. Thank you for doing this, Mackenzie. I wish you a good weekend, and I hope we see each other very soon.
Thank you, Fabrice. Thanks all.
Ciao,
Thanks,
bye-bye.
everybody. Take
Thanks,
care.
everybody.